Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
Life is not the same for everyone. Where you are born, who you are born to, and even the generation you are born in has a massive impact on the rules of engagement you must play with as you proceed through the game of life. For every one of us, each and every outcome rests on the knife's edge of choice, chance, and circumstance. Early life mostly plays out in the hands of others, our parents and our teachers. But as we progress, our individual choices and experiences become critical to a life of either happiness or challenge. But seldom in either case is it ever that black or white or mutually exclusive. In my case, in the early 70s and not long after Vietnam and Woodstock, natural selection had me straight out of my mother's womb and into a maelstrom of misfits and dysfunction in the suburbs of Adelaide, South Australia.
Warren Rankine is a South Australian man who spent much of his life growing up in Adelaide's western suburbs. As a Ngarrindjeri descendant and with no formal education, he started an award-winning brand and building company in 2005. His story is one of significant childhood trauma, personal development, growth and achievement. Warren is a first-time author. Today I'm talking to Warren Rankine about his memoir, 15 Feet Tall. Warren is joined by Tracy Yong, brand manager for FolioFox, who worked with Warren in self-publishing his memoir. Warren and Tracy, welcome to the Good Reading Podcast.
G'day, Greg.
Hi, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Warren, the foreword to this book is one of the most direct, disarming and insightful few paragraphs I'd read for a long time. I was immediately engaged with your story, and I'll use your words here, straight out of my mother's womb and into a maelstrom of misfits and dysfunction in the suburbs of Adelaide. Take me into that world and through that experience.
Taking into that world is largely out of recollection. My displacement as a 2-year-old was quite unique in as far as that being a part Aboriginal child in a predominantly white family led to my displacement at the hands of my extended family back in the early 1970s. My displacement in foster care was due to a number of factors. There was ill health in certain families. There was a non-suitability of my placement within certain families. And so as a child, I never really got the opportunity to spend an extended period with one family. I think the longest period I had with one family was 3.5 years, between the ages of about 8 and 11.
Were there fun times amongst the difficulties?
I think as a child, no matter what circumstances you're in, I think it's completely normal as a child, regardless of their dysfunction and their environment, to try and find the fun. And so, that's just a childlike behaviour to kind of find joy in no matter what practical circumstance you find yourself in. And certainly that was the case for me. I still, rode bikes and I still played cricket with the kids in the street, and it didn't really change. The fun element really didn't change. It was more the environment away from the fun that was the challenging part of my existence in my early adolescence.
And how did you go at school?
Well, I was a particularly bright kid, and but that kind of got scuttled by the instability. So I was often distracted easily. I was often a target for other children due to my temperament and I guess the lack of that stability that I craved and that other kids took for granted. So school, as much as I could do the work, it was more environmentally that I couldn't focus and I couldn't concentrate long enough, and that opened me up to, I guess, a challenging time. I guess when I was at school, whilst I was safe and it was constant, I couldn't really apply myself the way that other kids could without there being, I guess, an emotional kind of impact on me due to the instability of moving around all the time.
During those times, did you have any sense of your Aboriginal identity?
Yeah, absolutely. I think given that my displacement kind of focused on or was centered around me being the product of a black father and a white mother, and then obviously the extended family being my grandparents had a huge influence on my displacement due to their, the familial shame and their embarrassment of having a black child in the family. It was impossible not to understand that as a young child that I was Aboriginal. Having said that, though, as I got a little bit older, I tried to conceal, or I didn't try to conceal, but I guess I didn't make a point of it towards other kids because I didn't really have the connection that other Aboriginal kids had to their family and community due to the fact that I was displaced into white foster families. And so at school, I was particularly sensitive to, I guess, not exposing myself to the questioning or the legitimacy that questions that other children might have, given that obviously my skin colour wasn't dark, whilst I had, an olive skin complexion, and you wouldn't have distinguished me as being an Aboriginal child unless you, I guess, knew what to look for.
And as I understand it, there's actually a process to becoming formally recognised as Indigenous. What was that like for you?
Well, that was born out of necessity from a practical perspective. So I got into my early 20s without any real documentation other than my State Department file. And when we got hold of that State Department file, due to the references and the constant, I guess, conversations and notations from social welfare agencies in South Australia, it was an undeniable fact. And so we went for practical reasons that are sort of akin to or aligned with us needing to buy a house or wanting to buy a house in our 20s. And then, ATSIC needing to, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission at the time, needing to validate my Aboriginality. So we went through a process with some elders and, they reviewed all the documents and they obviously did a bit of a family tree trace and yeah, we got what they call a common seal in, I think it was 1996, I think that was.
Just touching on those files that you mentioned, it's a series of extracts from your own files from the South Australian Department for Community Welfare, and they're included in 15 Feet Tall. It's fascinating reading in itself. I wondered what it was like for you reading those files for the first time, what it told you about yourself, and your impression of the community welfare system at that time.
Yeah, I find it fascinating myself. I think, regardless of my own personal involvement in those files, they do make for interesting reading just from a historical fact. And it's not something that you can find easily. A lot of people don't go to the trouble of accessing their file under freedom of information. Again, we did it on the basis of proving my Aboriginality. And when I did look at those files for the first time, they were enormously confronting. And so, we got those files when I was 23 years of age or 24 years of age, around that time. And when you think about the timelines, I wasn't that far removed out of no longer being a ward of the state. And so, to get them as a young man, I found them particularly raw and I found them particularly difficult to read. And so as it stands, we read a few of those files. We found some really confronting stuff in there, and I then put it in a box for about 25 years and hardly touched it until we wrote the book. It told me a lot about myself because I guess as a product of the PTSD that early childhood trauma brings with it, you tend to suppress a lot of those emotions and feelings. And again, you kind of remove yourself from those feelings and memories. And so reading it back, it then retells your story in other people's words. And so you get this unique opportunity to, I guess, line up other people's versions with your own version and try and make sense of it that way. And so again, it's not a particularly common thing. Lots of people have their files. I guess mine's particularly unique because of the Aboriginality, the foster care, the displacement, all that stuff sort of woven into my file makes it a particularly unique set of documents.
From reading this book, I got the impression that I was reading the words of a man who had come to terms with that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you get to a point in your life where you have to accept what you're going through, what you've been through, the sum of your experiences. And I think that's the same for any middle-aged human being, female, male, doesn't matter, line of work. We all get to that middle age and reflect. And I guess for me, there was a certain amount of acceptance that I had to come to terms with. And that took a lot of work. It took a lot of work in my early 50s, only 3 or 4 years ago, to really break the back of getting on top of that and processing all of that early childhood trauma.
Tracy, over to you. What struck you about Warren's story that prompted you to work with him in bringing his story into print?
So one of our account managers, Berit, and I were both manning a booth at Book Fair Australia to represent FolioFox. And she met Warren there, and she was really taken by his story, and she read the book and she absolutely loved it. It's how I was introduced to him, and it's how we got to know each other. It's been a really great experience trying to promote his book through our platform, in that whilst we're a book printing company, FolioFox also tries to do what we can to platform authors and help them kickstart their journeys and get more people reading the books that we print for them. I think it only makes sense to do that and support the local literary community in Australia as well. So hearing about Warren's experience and getting to meet him, it feels like a story that needs to be told and that people need to learn about, because it's integral to so many different facets of society that are just not spoken about a lot. And to me, it feels like the kind of novel that a traditional publisher should have published, and it's the type of novel that I would expect to see in the middle of a readings bookstore, or, you know, in the main aisle of a Big W when I walk past books there, because it's the type of book that I know many people in my personal life would be really intrigued and would want to read. That's what's really driven me as well to support Warren and through FolioFox and what we're able to do here.
Take me through the process of self-publishing, from initial contact to finished product.
At FolioFox, we specialize in commercial book printing. So a lot of what we do is when you've already got a ready-to-print book and bringing it to life, so actually printing it, binding it, finishing the cover and so on, and then delivering it to the author or to the distribution warehouse. And we have self-publishing authors come to us. They'll be at very different stages across the board. Some of them will be ready to print. They've already got a formatted PDF file. They've got their work ready to go. Warren was like that, and that he had already done his first print run before, and he wanted more books. But it was also a process of refining that, right? And then some authors come to us and they've literally just got a Word document and they have no idea what to do next. They just know, like, oh, I've written the book now, I just need to print it, right? So self-publishing will incorporate a lot of other stages to get that book ready to be printed. And then once it's printed, then probably the biggest phase and the biggest obstacle for any self-publishing author is next, because now that you've got the book in physical form, now what? It's about marketing it, it's about getting it to people, it's about distributing it, and that's the really hard part. Our job at FolioFox, if anything, we've got, you could say, an easier stage where it's pretty straightforward. We're providing a service, and at least what we can do is be there to support the authors while they're undergoing that full process, because it is really complex, it can be really overwhelming. And what we can do is also give them the options to customize the book so that it's exactly what they dream of. A lot of other places, when you think of where you get your books printed, like print-on-demand platforms like Ingram Spark, they have quite limited options for paper, for sizes, and ways that they can curate and customize how the book looks and feels. And it's great for authors to be able to have an active partnership, an actual collaboration, and someone they can speak to say, like, oh, this paper might work much better. Or for Warren's case, for example, we did a couple of different printed proofs because we noticed how the front cover just wasn't quite, like, the colors weren't coming out quite right. The boy on the front cover, which is him when he was younger, obviously, was looking really flushed, like he'd just gone for a run or something. There was a little bit too much magenta coming from the printer. And because we're a local printing facility, none of it's done offshore, we're able to sort of tweak the settings of the printer, figure out exactly how do we want to make the colors turn out, how do we want the boy, how do we want Warren to look like he should look on the cover, and for it to really represent him, and for the cover to do justice to the story that he wants to tell.
Warren, why did you decide to self-publish?
There are a number of reasons. I'd been so heavily involved, obviously, in writing the book, and I guess emotionally involved in the outcome, that I really didn't want to go into a situation commercially. And given that I'm in business, I've got a building business in Adelaide, so I've got some commercial, I guess, understanding. And so I didn't really want to take the book into a place where it faced judgment on the back of a select group of people who either didn't understand it, couldn't see any commercial value in the book, and weren't invested emotionally. And so the decision to self-publish was more about protecting the story. I wanted to be able to write my story the way that I lived my story, because I thought that if it got kind of edited, or it got, I guess, cleansed, or it got, how do you put it, politically corrected, then I just felt that it would lose its edge, and I didn't want to take that chance with my own story. And so I gatekept that a little bit, and I guess, it's paid off, because whilst we don't have the exposure that obviously a commercial release might have, it's really brought an authenticity into the book. And so I get to, doing book fairs and doing things like this gives me an opportunity to passionately and authentically promote the book. And I think that's a really important thing that gets lost, because authors put so much time and effort into the writing of the book, and yet a lot of the time that's taken out of their hands. The results of the book commercially get taken out of their hands. And I just felt that I could have a really positive influence on how this book made its way out into the world.
And what advice would you give to others contemplating telling their story?
Strap yourself in, because it's a ride. That's the first thing. But I'd also say be prepared to work. I guess one of the things that I think we fall for in social media and in publishing in general is that we see the end result, but we don't see the process. And so anyone that's written a book, it's a major achievement to even finish authoring a book, regardless of its commercial success or its exposure. So that's the first thing. Be proud of yourself for at least getting to that point. But then if you really want to make an impact with the book, you've got to do the work, and you've got to be prepared to, I guess there are times when, nothing's happening. The phone's not ringing. People are not returning emails. Bookstores are ignoring your request to stock. There's all this stuff that I guess, stands up against you in the process. But I would say my biggest piece of advice is be determined and work really, really hard to get the result that you're looking for.
Warren, if I can take you back to the beginning of 15 Feet Tall, and a phrase that struck me there, the life I never chose. At what point did you decide to forge your own future, and what was the catalyst for change?
That's an interesting question, and one that can be answered in, I guess, multiple answers, because that happened on multiple occasions. I did so at the age of 14 when I physically removed myself from foster care in running away from my last foster care parent. So I did that at 14. And then there were moments of reckoning all through my life, I guess, when I had a serious fail at 18 and learned the really valuable information that changed my life in Maslow's hierarchy, the human constructive of human, I guess, the constructive human needs. And so, within a few short years, there was a couple of examples, and then obviously becoming a parent for the first time, and then I guess starting a business in my early 30s, and then again I think the journey never stopped. In my early 50s, I made some lifestyle decisions to change the way that I self-cared, if you like, and took care of myself, and that meant stepping back from my business a little bit, reducing my workload, and getting a lot more work-life balance into my life. So great question, but yeah, I think every human being has multiple occasions in their life, whether they realise it or they don't, where there are these sliding doors moments where you make, conscious choices to impact where your journey's headed.
You are also an advocate for the process of reconciliation in Australia and the idea that we have a shared history and all Australians have a responsibility to participate in that process. What would you like Australians to understand about that shared history?
that it's a complex shared history, and that it really is on all of us. I think this is for new Australians as well, people coming into the country for the first time. It's on all of us to learn the history of our nation. And we can't, whilst we physically in our generation can't do anything to change that, we can change the way that we view First Nations and Indigenous people in this country. And I think there needs to be, and it's a well understood theme, and I think Australian society is getting better at this, but there needs to be more empathy at just the amount of complexity that First Nations people face in telling their stories and continuing to tell their stories. And given that far north Queensland down to the Coorong, where my mob are from, and across to Western Australia and in the Central Desert, there's that much diversity in our First Nations people that it's not a one size fits all. It really is, and that's why it's really incumbent on the Australian people to be caring and be careful about how they treat our First Nations people.
Warren Rankine and Tracy Yong, thanks so much for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
Thanks very much, Greg. That was fantastic.
Thanks, Greg. It was great to meet you.
I've been talking to Warren Rankine about his memoir, 15 Feet Tall, and to Tracy Yong, brand manager for FolioFox. 15 Feet Tall is self-published, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to Good Reading print and online magazine at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.